Welcome to the next episode of the HR Mavericks podcast. Today, I'm joined by Tamara Jones in Minnesota, some of my old stomping grounds. Love to have you here on the show. We're super happy to have you on the show, Tamara. And Tamara is a senior HR generalist at Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. Tamara, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
It's doing great. It's great to have you on the show. I love it when I can find people who live in Minnesota. I loved living there a couple of years ago when I was there. So hope everything is okay. I know the weather can be kind of crazy. You mentioned a hailstorm recently.
Yeah, just about an hour and a half ago, we had a hailstorm come through just as we were getting to the end of a training about trauma. And so it was a fitting end to the day, I guess.
I guess so. Wow. Well, we're not here to talk about Minnesota, but for anyone who hasn't been there, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful place. So Tamara, we're super excited to have you on the show today. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about what you do and your career background?
So thanks for having me on, Garrett. My background in HR is unusual. So you're right. I'm currently working for the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center as their senior HR generalist. I just started there about 3.5 weeks ago and just kind of had to hit the ground running. But before that, excuse me, I worked in the labor movement, and I've spent my career working in the labor movement. I've worked for 3 different unions. Excuse me. And so throughout that time, I was a union representative. So I negotiated contracts. I sat on hiring panels. I helped develop policy. But my primary goal was to represent workers in disputes or issues with their employers. So I come to HR with this wealth of knowledge about what are workers looking for, what are they interested in, what are some of the pitfalls out there. And so I bring all that knowledge, and now I'm just kind of sitting on the other side of the table and thinking, how can we do this better? Yeah. It doesn't have to be a battle.
I love that. I think you have such a unique perspective to provide that many in the HR space don't. And so that's awesome that, like you said, you've been able to sit on both sides of the table there in your career and have that perspective to bring. So we're super excited to have you on the show. I know you've been an active member of the HR Mavericks community since we started last year. So we love your contributions and excited to dive into this topic with you. Should we jump into it?
Great. We should.
Okay. Well, while you and I were talking about what do we talk about today on the show, you kind of mentioned this idea that's really top of mind for so many small businesses, which is really about how do you prevent employee turnover? And I loved, you sent me a proposed title, and it was, why is everyone leaving us? Right. And I'm sure there's many businesses, especially small businesses out there, who are feeling that right now. Like, what is happening as, we have this great resignation or migration as so many different employees are switching jobs the last few years. And so we want to talk a little bit more about that today. And so to really jumpstart that conversation, I just want to ask you, why do you think that we are seeing such high employee turnover right now? Obviously, there are, major changes that have impacted the entire country and world with COVID and so many other things the last few years. But, outside of those things, why else do you feel like, there is such high employee turnover, especially with small businesses?
So I don't think we can discount the pandemic and what the pandemic brought forth in the workforce. And maybe this was kind of a revolution in the making, and the pandemic just hastened it. Yeah. But really what I think what it did was it gave workers a chance to realize what they've been missing and and how work isn't everything. And it is possible to be home and work. It is possible to have a work-life balance. It's possible to hang out with your friends and have fun and still get your work done, because the nature of remote work allowed for that flexibility. And obviously it's not a perfect solution, right? Because there's like direct support services where you can't have the ability to work from home. But I think it really woke all workers up. And I include HR in that. And I include, CEOs, we're all workers. It woke us up to like, there is more to life than work. When you think about it, we spend more time with our coworkers than we do with our family. And I think the pandemic reversed that.
Yeah.
Because we were working from home and we had our kids, like, we had to take care of our pets. We had to deal with things because we literally had to.
Yeah.
And we realized, I think, that that we could have both. And that we I would almost say sort of changed our values a little bit from that kind of American work first overall to, you know what, no, we need that balance.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I totally agree. I think the pandemic was probably just the catalyst of this, if you will, right? Like this is probably something that's probably been in the making for a while, and people have thought about it, maybe talked about it, but to have everyone be forced to be home for a while, some people not working, some people working remotely, it is a change in mindset, right? For so many, workers. And so then the next question then becomes, if you can't have that balance or get that once this pandemic has, we've slowly gotten back into semi-normal life, right? For many of us, then you start wondering if there's somewhere else you can go where you can find that balance. Is that right?
I absolutely. And I think, one of the things we talked about is like, what are employees looking for? I don't know that employees are necessarily looking for more money. Certainly when I left my last position, it wasn't because I was looking for more money. I just needed that better work-life balance. And so I think people are looking for work-life balance. They're looking for pay equity. They're looking for what other benefits, tangible benefits or intangible, does your company provide? And are you willing to meet me where I'm at?
Yeah.
And I also think employees are more, or I shouldn't say employees, but workers are more able now to, what's the word? Voice what their needs are. And so I think articulate what their needs are is what I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So we're now in this state where so many businesses are seeing employees leave. And so what can these small businesses do to really engage employees and, over time improve their retention?
So I was joking as I was walking out with a couple of my coworkers today about not why you shouldn't do pizza parties. And I think I put that in an email to you.
Yeah.
And it's not that you shouldn't do pizza parties, right? Because, I like pizza. We had pizza for lunch today. Everyone's, laughing and joking about the pizza. It's doing the pizza party in lieu of other things, or as the only reward. And I'm reminded of, I think I saw on one of the HR Facebook groups that there was a post that went a little viral where the company was doing this huge sales promotion. They were promising a huge reward to the sales team that did the best, got the best deal. And so everyone pitched in, like the goal was exceeded. And then the reward was 4 bags of Hostess donuts. That was the big reward. So when I think about that, I think like, okay, so that was their big reward. Now, when you say we're going to make our next sales pitch, what's going to happen? Not only is your team that was the star performer going to be like, we just got 4 bags of donuts. That team's not going to participate or be excited about it. But the message that is sent throughout the company to the entire company, not just the sales part, but to your janitor, to your receptionist, to, your CEO, is that we're only worth 4 bags of donuts. And so I think you can do pizza parties, but you have to give better. You have to do better than just pizza. You have to find out what your employees, what motivates them, and what do they want, which kind of ties into the biggest thing about improving retention, including your employees in the decisions that affect them. and including them in the discussions that involve them, and from the top down, from the bottom up. And I think it's almost more important to go from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Because when they have ownership and buy-in into what decisions are being made, what policies you're putting into place, that gives them agency, it gives them a loyalty, and gives them that feeling of inclusion.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. As you're talking, I'm just thinking about the last episode that we did for HR Mavericks. We really talked about culture. I had a guest on it. We talked about culture. And one of the things he said that really stood out to me is really when it comes down to culture, there's like two things that employees need. They need trust and they need psychological safety in the workplace, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, there can be other tools and things that people need to get their job done, but like those are some of the two most important things. And so really, as I'm hearing you explain, what you just did, I'm just thinking about, it really comes down to trust, right? You're building a culture in that organization that hopefully employees feel valued and they feel trusted. And if you can do that in the right way, and many times you do that through your policies and other things that you put in place, right? So we talk about, going back to the culture analogy, we think about culture and we think about Google and, companies that have food and ping pong tables or pizza parties, right? But really, if that's where it starts and ends, you're going to fall short every time. It really comes back to trust and safety. People feel safe and they feel valued. And then some of those other things can help them feel rewarded and valued again. Is that right?
I absolutely. And I think just in my experience, when you're thinking about policies and you're thinking about building that trust, again, it's easy to come up with the bright idea for a policy. But if you don't think it through and you don't talk to the people that are the policy is going to affect and get their input, the policy will be not as effective. And so having that communication builds that trust and builds that value. And I'm a huge fan of Stephen Farber, and it's absolutely right about that psychological safety. If you don't feel safe at the workplace, you're also not going to stay, and it creates that toxic culture.
Yeah, totally. That makes total sense. So I want to ask you then, you mentioned policies, you mentioned including employees in important decisions and discussions. What are examples of that are common, especially with small businesses, where you should definitely, you'd recommend that these small businesses make sure that employees are included?
Oh, there's so many. And I know like people think small businesses don't need to have policies because we're just a big family or, but I think what policies do, and you don't even have to call them policies, you can call them whatever you want, but they lay out that expectation and that accountability. And I think, PTO is a good one. Making sure that you have equity, which equity doesn't necessarily mean equality. Not everybody has to get 8 hours of PTO. If it doesn't make sense for their job, like you want to make sure that you're looking at it as from an equitable standpoint. Dress codes is another one. If you say everybody has to be in business casual, well, that might be great for your front-facing people, but why does your janitor have to be in business casual? And does that make sense for him if he's dealing with chemicals to clean the floor? Like khaki pants are going to wear out really fast.
Yeah.
And so, making sure that whoever the policy is going to affect, you should think about, you should think about two things. One, from a racial equity lens, just like, are there unintentional consequences to your least paid employees or your most vulnerable employee? So you want to include that person in the conversation because they're going to bring something to the table that you didn't think about. And again, it creates that value that my employer is listening to me. They care what I have to say, and they want to make it better for me.
Yeah.
And that will help reduce your turnover.
I think you're absolutely right. Really, when it comes down to it, when you can include employees in those decisions and discussions, they feel trust, they feel engaged. And ultimately, like what it comes back to is that ultimately helps improve your retention, right?
Right. And a good example is right now at my work, we're talking about family leave, and looking at changing the family leave policy and to create paid family leave, which is an important aspect of the community that I'm working in. And so we have a policy committee that includes everybody, or representation from all of the different groups that we have, so that we get that input, so that when we present it to the board, we've taken into account everybody. And we take into account that, again, that equity doesn't mean equal, but that that it is as equitable as we can make it.
Yeah, really good points. I think that's so good. The next question I really have for you is, you kind of mentioned this when we were, talking about this topic today. And you mentioned this phrase of how can small businesses make sure that their grass is the greener grass in the long run, right? Because so many times employees think that the grass is greener somewhere else, right? And so when it comes down to it, how can businesses make it appear and in reality have their grass be the greener grass?
So there's a lot of different ways to answer this question. But I think the first thing you have to do is you have to talk to your employees. You have to talk to your current employees about what do they like about being here, what is making them stay, and what could they improve. And it's a difficult conversation. So I prefer to do surveys, which they're not the best, right? But if you do an anonymous survey, then people don't feel like they're being put on the spot. Mm-hmm. And they can feel like they have the freedom to express themselves. I don't know that it always is great for creating that dialogue, but at least it gives you some information to start from. And so to find out what they love, what they don't love, and then get their thoughts and ideas about the company, but also exit interviews. You have to do those exit interviews, especially if you are blindsided by an employee leaving. I mean, you tend to know when somebody's thinking about leaving if you're in touch with your group, but if it comes out of the blue, like, you want to talk to that employee, like, did they get offered something they couldn't refuse, either, way more money, or, were they given a chance at a large title increase, whatever it is, but having those conversations as to why employees are leaving. But again, to keep your grass greener is really about talking to your current staff about what's important to them, why are they staying there, what could be improved upon, and then just staying ahead of trends and watching and educating yourself. So the trend over the last year, and you probably could talk to this more than I can, because I'm just scratching the surface as we start to look at our PTO policy, is that unlimited PTO. Mm-hmm. Everybody, that was the hot thing for a while. And now I think people are seeing that it's not working. And so you probably know a little bit more about it than I do, but, so that was the greener grass for a long time, but maybe it's not the best.
Yeah.
Just staying educated.
Yeah. I think you make some really good points there. And I think, again, it comes back to making sure that the people on your team feel trusted and they feel valued, that they're part of the conversation. And that then the second piece is that you don't let things get stale. It's really easy to let things get stale, especially if you have a company that's been around for a while. You always can fall back on, this is how we've always done it, right? But ideally, your policies, your procedures, your company, your culture should be evolving with the needs of who you have working there, right? So making sure you can always come back to it and have an open dialogue about what needs to change. And so people feel valued being able to share that. And you're regularly seeking out input from others on how you can improve and evolve and change. And if you approach it from that mindset, I think that's at least what I'm hearing you say. That's how, in the long run, you show that you have the greener grass, quote unquote, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And an example of that I have is we talk in the labor community, we do labor management committees. And, there's some negative around it. People's always they're just going to be a big gripe session. But when you have an effective committee and both sides work to be effective, you can make actual change and solve actual problems. And so, couple examples that I have is there was a nursing home in it that I represented, and the it was right up against the train tracks. And at night, the the employees didn't necessarily feel safe going out to their car at shift change, because the parking lot wasn't well lit. There was no money to replace the lights in the parking lot because, nursing homes not swimming in money.
Yeah.
And so we brought the problem to the table and said, we have to make our employees feel safe, our members feel safe. And managers like, well, obviously we need to make them feel safe. And so we worked through figuring out a buddy system, paid time, so that like employees got paid to like walk each other to the car and like make sure that people got in safe until there was money to fix the lights.
Yeah.
And then along the same time at a hospital, there's a big hospital complex, and they went to electronic pay stubs, but you could print out your own. But there was no printer in the building that the members that I represented worked in. And when I left, we went through 7 layers of bureaucracy. They still had to walk a mile to go print their pay stubs. And so that's an example of when it doesn't work. Like somebody should have just been able to say, put a printer over there. Like how hard is that? But don't get so bogged down in the bureaucracy of it. Like if it makes sense, just do it.
Yeah. I think those are such great points. Really, really good examples. So awesome. Tamara, this has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining and sharing some of your stories and insights. As we kind of wrap up here, one question I like to ask all of the guests that we have on the show is really just what's one thing that you think our listeners should do this week to improve their HR or people functions? And again, doesn't necessarily have to be related to what we talked about today, but what's one of those tangible tips that you would recommend people go and do this week?
So when you were talking about this question, as I was thinking about the answer, so I have 3, but I'll be brief.
Good.
So the first one is make sure you're joining HR Mavericks if you haven't already, but if you're watching the podcast, you probably have. Second is I really like what Stephen Farber's saying about communication. I think he's making some really good strides, and so I'd encourage you to check out his LinkedIn and his podcast. And then really start looking at your policies with an equity lens and make sure that you're looking at those consequences to your most vulnerable employee, whether that's a single mom or an immigrant. Make sure that the policies come from that lens of equity.
I love that. Really, really great. And appreciate the plug for the HR Mavericks community there too. So Tamara, thank you again for taking the time to join us and share your insights with us. If there are listeners who want to get in contact with you, maybe they have follow-up questions on the topic or just want to pick your brain on something else, what's the best way for them to do that?
The easiest way would be to just find me on LinkedIn. I'm on there quite often, or you can go to miwrc.org and find me on the website there.
Awesome. Well, I'd encourage you to reach out to Tamara if you have questions for her. We will drop that information in the show notes. You can find it there also. So Tamara, hope you have a great rest of the day with limited hailstorms in Minnesota.
Cross your fingers.
Thanks.
So, thank you.